Hi, my name is Morris Franco. This is the second part of the 6th video I'm doing on the national debt crisis. I am trying to explain why I think there's a real possibility the U.S. government will default on its treasury securities sometime within the next 30 years, if not much sooner. And one thing I wanted to explain before I get into it was in the previous video I used the term bond vigilantes repeatedly, and I want to explain what a bond vigilante is. And it's not, for some reason it gives me a picture of the Old West, but that's not what it's all about. The bond vigilante is any entity that sees an opportunity in the bond market to make a fast buck. And a bond vigilante can be anybody from a small brokerage house to a sovereign nation. And we're talking about tens, hundreds of billions of dollars to change hands in a flash. And in the bond market, it's possible to buy and sell bonds, what they call on a future basis. That means you sell, let's say, for 2 weeks down the road, and within 2 weeks you can buy it back and just take your gain or loss without ever putting up a dime or a minimal amount. And bonds trade on a very small percentage of their actual value. So you can trade huge amounts of bonds without posting huge amounts of money. All right, back to the analysis. And I'm going to start where I left off on the last one, which in my opinion is one of the main reasons that the national debt is out of sight and out of mind. And the paragraph is growing the debt without pain. The national debt grew about 70% to almost $17 trillion by 2013, from $10 trillion in 2008. The Fed's low interest rate policy was in effect throughout the period, yet the amount of debt interest paid barely budged from year to year. This was made possible by the fact that debt issued prior to the Fed's low rate policy yielded higher rates, and upon maturity were rolled over at the current low rates. This had the effect of keeping the growth of the national debt out of the public eye, as the government was able to increase the size of the national debt massively without having to increase a comparable amount of debt interest. The creditworthiness of the United States. The vast majority of Americans consider Treasury securities one of the safest investments on the planet. After all, they're backed by the full faith and credit of the U.S. government. Unfortunately, that guarantee isn't worth what it used to be. Up until 2011, all government securities carried the highest possible rating by the 3 major credit agencies. It is now down to 2 credit agencies. The bogus employment picture and the big 4% factor. While I believe the Department of Labor statistics misrepresents the true labor picture, the one statistic I do believe is the labor participation rate. The details of this statistic are unknown to me, but that's not important. What matters is the trend, which has been heading south since 2002, when it was 67% and accelerated downward under the Obama administration to 63%, a 30-year low. And I'll show you the chart. And I think this is the only chart I'm going to show you in a second. And this is a chart of the unemployment rate. I don't know from when you can't read the numbers on the side, but anyway, the arrow I wrote in there is when Obama took office, and you can see what happened since then. I'm not saying he started from day one, but his policy certainly had a major effect on it. Another hole in the employment picture is the way unemployment is calculated. An individual who lost his job is counted as unemployed. As soon as he stops looking for a new job, he's no longer considered unemployed by the Bureau of Labor Statistics. The deciding factor is the state of mind of the former employee and how he views his job prospects. How stupid is that? If you're capable of working and you're not working, you're unemployed, period. Who would believe that encouraging an unemployed person to look for work would cause the unemployment rate to rise? In other words, it benefits the party in power to discourage an unemployed worker from seeking employment because his admission of interest in finding a job will raise the unemployment rate. more stupidity. The 800-pound gorilla in the room. All that being said, these problems are minor when compared to the national debt, the interest needed to fund it, and the massive and perpetual budget deficits it will create. There is no doubt the national debt is the 800-pound gorilla in the room, but it's what's totally mind-blowing is that the gorilla goes mostly unnoticed. As I said in the past, politicians downplay the issue, the media ignores it, and no taxpayer has knowingly paid 10 cents toward the reduction of the national debt. The debt interest explosion. Of course, predicting budgets 30 years into the future is foolish. The uncertainties are boundless. However, the issues surrounding national debt are quantifiable and we can make predictions using various scenarios. There are 4 factors to consider: the cost of ongoing government programs, the cost of interest needed to fund the national debt, the size of the national debt, and interest rates. As the national debt grows, it will become the defining factor in the growth of the budget and budget deficits. Growth from ongoing and new government programs will become less and less of a factor. When will interest rates return to normal? On this issue, the Federal Reserve has all the power, as it is an independent agency not answerable to the President or Congress. The party in power exerts enormous pressure on the Fed to keep rates low in order to stimulate the economy, spur employment, and minimize budget deficits. On the other side of the coin, the Fed is under pressure to push rates higher when inflation rears its ugly head. As the economy has been in the tank since 2007 housing bust, the Fed had kept rates at record lows and promises to continue this policy until it's satisfied with the state of the economy and the unemployment rate. Fed's action on employment rates has enormous consequences. On a $20 trillion debt, every 1 point in interest rates equates to $200 billion in additional debt interest. That's $200 billion for each point. Moving rates from the current 2% to a normal average of 6% will increase the debt by $800 billion annually over the long run. If the 30-year Treasury bond is at risk for default prior to maturity, as I believe it is, rising interest rates will be the primary reason. The CBO, the Congressional Budget Office, expects the national debt to hit $20 trillion by 2016 or 2017. This was their 2013 estimate. Bear in mind there's more to budget deficits than just debt interest. In 2013, debt interest was responsible for only 1/3 of the budget deficit. Since I am certain the party in power will do next to nothing to address the never-ending budget deficits and growing national debt, I expect almost all budget overruns to be dumped onto the national debt. If, as I expect, the scenario plays out continuously through 2043, the national debt will reach 60 to 120 trillion, and that's without including deficits from other budget programs. Also bear in mind that over the last 30 years, the budget grew at twice the rate of inflation. I showed you charts on that already. As the national debt reaches 40, 50, or 60 trillion or more, and our country's credit rating falls, investors will demand ever higher interest rates to compensate for the added risk. The outlook for this country's credit rating is dim. The political and economic winds are blowing in the wrong direction. Okay, now I need you to pay close attention because I'm going to throw a bunch of numbers at you and it's going to be a little hard to follow. Okay, the title of the paragraph is The Path to Armageddon. Debt interest in 2013 should have been more than 4 times greater than we actually paid, or nearly 1.1 trillion instead of the current estimate of 250 billion. The average interest rate for the 45-year period prior to the Fed's easy money policy was about 6%, probably much higher. If interest rates were allowed to float, the average rate would probably be even higher due to the growth in the national debt and the declining creditworthiness of the United States. Let's start in the year 2020 with an estimated national debt of 22 trillion and an estimated budget deficit of 700 billion. Add to that 700 billion, 850 billion to cover the increased debt interest resulting from return to normal interest rates. That's 850 billion more in interest than the $250 billion we paid in 2013 while the Fed's low interest policy was in effect. These two items taken together bring the 2020 budget deficit to more than $1.5 trillion. So unless the government cuts spending or raises taxes to meet this budget shortfall, we will add this $1.5 trillion to the national debt, which will bring it to a total of $23.5 trillion. Remember, we started with $22 trillion at the start of the year. At the end of the year, we're up to $23.5 trillion. Because the national debt is financed by Treasury securities of various maturities, ranging from the one-year Treasury bill to the 30-year Treasury bond, interest rate changes will not affect the entire debt all at once. Rate changes affect 40% of the debt in the first year, 55% the second year, 70% in the third year, 76% in the fourth year, 82% in the fifth year, and so on. The example I just cited starts in 2020. I also assume the interest rate lag will not have a material effect. Stay with me on this. The following year, 2021, we have the same problem, except we have to pay debt on the national debt of $23.5 trillion instead of $22 trillion. This will require adding another $1.5 trillion to the national debt to cover the previous deficit and an additional $82 billion to cover the extra debt interest caused by the previous year's increase. This raises the national debt to over $25 billion in just 2 years. Try to visualize the disaster facing our country if the government takes no action on the debt crisis, and this scenario plays out continuously for another 21 years to 2043. The figures I started with in 2020, the estimated budget deficit of $700 billion and $850 billion in additional debt interest from a return to normal interest rates, are realistic. The interest on the growing debt is simply a math calculation. In fact, I severely underestimate the damage because the 5% rate is currently too low and assumes the top credit rating, in my opinion, in order for investors to accept a 5% interest rate. I think that number I calculated was based on a 5% rate. It might have been based on 6. I'm really not sure. The United States will need a stable budget and a manageable national debt in addition to a top credit rating. None of these exist now, nor are there any reason to believe they will anytime soon. Doing the math. I start with a national debt of $22 trillion and compounded each year for a 23-year period. I showed the effect of the growing debt using 4 different interest rates from 5% to 8%. I showed you that card in the first part of this video. The figure worked out to $67 trillion in 2043 at 5%. At a 5% annual rate, jumped to 84% at a 6% rate, 104 trillion at a 7% rate, and 129 trillion at an 8% rate. Bear in mind these figures are solely on the growth of the national debt resulting from debt interest and have not factored in additional spending from any future or expanded government programs. Add the latter and it should boost 2043 national debt by another 25 to 50%. Under these scenarios, the annual debt interest amounts will range from $3 trillion to $10 trillion. Don't forget, $3 trillion to $10 trillion. We're talking about $100 trillion debt, so it's not out of the realm of possibility. Okay, stalking a wounded animal. I don't have much more to go, so bear with me. Of course, I can't turn the pages. Okay. The growing debt and deficit problem will have consequences well beyond the tax bill. America's inability to manage its finances has already resulted in a credit downgrade by S&P. The going problem makes further downgrades all but inevitable. Credit downgrades force bond issuers to pay higher interest rates to compensate for the higher risk. In order to guarantee low rates in spite of credit downgrades, the Federal Reserve plays games, shilling for the government, by purchasing more than $1 trillion a year in treasuries and mortgage-backed securities, trumping the higher rates disgruntled investors demand. Normally, in a rising rate environment, investors would sell short with the goal of repurchasing them at lower prices brought on by the higher rates. In my opinion, this is a flawed strategy because as the national debt grows, the Fed strategy will lose credibility. Investors worldwide will see a weaker America and back off from buying U.S. government securities unless interest rates are raised to reflect their true risk. What investor would be willing to lend the United States their money at the current low rates for 30 years when we carry a national debt near the size of the GDP of the entire European Union? Where money is involved, there are no nice guys. The weaker America's credit comes, the faster bond vigilantes will pounce. Investors of every kind will run from U.S. bonds, ranging from pension funds to sovereign nations. This will force the Treasury to keep boosting rates and start a cycle of increasing budget deficits and expanding national debt. The Federal Reserve is in fact the sovereign bank of the United States. The sovereign bank of Greece was unable to prevent default of Greek government bonds, and bondholders lost 50% of their principal investments. Spain and Italy also got into similar trouble and were able to prevent the crisis only because of the European Union's intervention. There is no entity on earth with the financial resources needed to bail out the United States. Should the debt crisis get out of control, the United States will face a financial Armageddon. In summary, if the national debt didn't exist, and the government could manage the balanced budget for the next 30 years, that would be great. But the national debt is real and humongous and will continue to grow at an accelerating pace. The only way to reduce the national debt is through a budget surplus, and the only way to freeze the national debt is to balance the budget. Unfortunately, the situation is only getting worse. In the last 6 years, 28 to 2013, the budget averaged more than $800 billion in deficit over and above the cost of debt interest. I'll repeat that. In the last 6 years, 28 to 2013, the budget averaged more than $800 billion in deficits over and above the cost of debt interest. Assigning blame for this crisis would appear relatively easy. Of course, Congress and the President's aggressive spending program are the main culprits. But the Federal Reserve should share some of the blame. Its charter is to fight inflation and keep unemployment down. While it's true the Fed does not have the power of the purse, it does have the power of the pulpit. When it speaks, those in power hang on every word. When the national debt crisis blew up and when the national debt crisis blows up, unemployment will skyrocket and will almost certainly have a negative effect on inflation. The Fed at a minimum should have been pounding the table warning Capitol Hill on the risk associated with unbalanced budget and the ballooning national debt. On this matter, it failed miserably. The political willingness to address this problem is almost non-existent because it conflicts with politicians' primary agenda, which is to get reelected. They rarely address this issue and usually minimize its seriousness. Their out-of-sight, out-of-mind strategy has proved to be a stunning success. I don't think you can find one citizen who believes he or she paid 1 cent in taxes that were used to pay down the national debt and therefore doesn't even think about it. Our leadership keeps kicking the can down the road, but they won't be able to keep doing this continuously through 2043. Of course, it's likely that intervention of some sort will take place before the national debt reaches that level. But then again, instead of looking forward 30 years, you go back 30 years to 2043 when the national debt was $1.4 trillion. I'm sure the same comment would have been made about the absurdity of a $17 trillion debt in 2013. While China and Russia awakened to the futility of socialism and the benefits of capitalism, we are stupidly moving in the opposite direction. In my opinion, we are governed by a president with extremely liberal agenda and Congress that needs a dictionary to find out the meaning of the word integrity. I believe the government has locked itself into spending programs that will result in continuous budget deficits as far as the eye can see. Think about this. It It will take more than $1 trillion in new taxes and/or budget cuts to get anywhere near a balanced budget. If by some miracle Congress does this, we will still carry annual debt interest of $1 trillion or more into infinity. Unfortunately, this is the most positive outcome, and there is zero chance of this happening. The most likely outcome is a default and all the ramifications that come with it. It won't bring an end to American exceptionalism because that's based on our constitutional principles, but we will knock it down a few notches. Anyway, that's the end of my presentation on national debt. I hope you found it informative.